They look the same. That is the entire point of one of them. But beneath identical cashmere, beneath the same absence of logos, two completely different psychological structures are operating. One of them performing invisibility, and one of them incapable of caring whether you see it at all. The internet decided that quiet luxury was old money with better PR. Beige tones, minimal branding, the deliberate retreat from the loud consumption of the previous decade. Aesthetic boards filled with Loro Piana and the Row, a visual grammar of restraint. And people looked at that grammar and concluded they had cracked the code. They had not. What they identified was a surface, a costume assembled from the idea of a psychology rather than the psychology itself. And that gap between performing a mental state and actually inhabiting it is not a stylistic difference. It is a structural one. Old money and quiet luxury are not 2 points on the same spectrum of taste. They are two different relationships to the concept of being perceived. Quiet luxury is a communication strategy. It says something. It says, I am sophisticated enough not to need to say anything. That sentence contains a contradiction it never resolves, because the sophistication must still be legible. The understatement still depends on an audience capable of reading it. The restraint is calibrated. The invisibility is engineered. This is not a criticism. It is simply what it is, a more refined version of status signaling, where the signal has been compressed into a frequency only certain people can detect. The exclusivity is the point. The subtlety is the message. Old money is not a communication strategy. It is the structural absence of needing one. The distinction sounds philosophical until you watch behavior. Then it becomes obvious. One of them is still playing the game with different pieces. The other has quietly left the table. Not as a statement, but because the game stopped being interesting several generations ago. Watch what happens in a room where status is being negotiated, which is most rooms. The quiet luxury practitioner has internalized the rules. They know which signals carry weight and which ones reveal effort. They choose correctly, consistently, and with discipline. Their restraint is a form of mastery, and mastery, by definition, still requires the field to exist. The old money individual does not register the negotiation as negotiation. They are not suppressing the impulse to perform. The impulse is absent. They wear what is comfortable. They speak without monitoring the reception. They walk into spaces without calculating how the space receives them. This is not confidence in the motivational sense. Confidence, as it is commonly described, implies awareness of a challenge being overcome. What old money exhibits is closer to indifference. Not performed indifference, which is simply another signal, but the structural kind that comes from a self-concept that was never attached to external recognition in the first place. You can detect it in the small moments. The way someone handles being unrecognized. The way they behave when there is no audience, or when the audience is wrong, or when the audience is not paying attention. Quiet luxury adjusts. Old money does not notice there was an adjustment to make. The need to be read is not vanity. It is older than that. Human beings are social creatures in the deepest neurological sense. Recognition, being accurately perceived by a group, was historically a survival function. To be misread was to be misplaced in the hierarchy. And misplacement, for most of human history, carried real consequences. The drive for legibility is not weakness, it is wiring. Quiet luxury understands this drive and sublimates it. It converts loud legibility into subtle legibility. It trades the need to be seen by everyone for the need to be seen by the right people. This is an evolution of the same mechanism, not an escape from it. The old money psychology, and here the word psychology is used deliberately, not as metaphor, represents something rarer, a self-concept that was constructed independently of social feedback loops, not in opposition to them, not in rejection of them, simply outside them. This happens when the feedback loop has been closed for long enough that it stops functioning as input. Several generations of consistent reinforcement of identity being treated as fixed rather than earned, produces a relationship to selfhood that does not require ongoing ratification. The identity does not need to be performed because it does not need to be proven. This is the mechanism, and it cannot be approximated through consumption, however refined. There is a philosophical tradition that distinguishes between being and appearing, between what a thing is and what a thing presents itself as being. The gap between those two states is where all social performance lives. Quiet luxury is sophisticated appearing. It has studied being so carefully that it can replicate the surface without the structure. It produces an extraordinarily accurate simulation of ease. And in most social contexts, the simulation is indistinguishable from the original, which is precisely the point of the simulation. But simulations are always oriented toward an observer. They require the category of the observer to exist. Even the most perfect performance of not performing is still a performance. What old money represents, at its psychological core, stripped of its romantic associations and class mythology, is a self that was never organized around the observer in the first place. Not because it rejected the observer, but because the observer was never installed as the primary reference point for self-assessment. This is the gap, and it is not closable by acquisition, because the thing that would need to change is not what someone owns or wears or knows. It is the architecture of how they relate to their own visibility. That architecture is built across time, across generations, across a childhood in which identity was treated as inheritance rather than achievement. It cannot be downloaded. It cannot be styled into existence. And it does not announce itself, because announcement is precisely what it has no use for. The deepest irony in this entire conversation is that old money does not know it is being talked about. It has no relationship to the discourse. The aesthetic boards, the trend cycles, the careful study of its signals, none of that reaches a psychology that was never monitoring the frequency. Quiet luxury is aspiration made elegant, and aspiration, by its nature, points towards something it has not yet become. Old money is not an aspiration. It is an inheritance of indifference, which is the one thing in the entire economy of status that cannot be purchased, curated, or quietly signaled into existence. The clothes are the same. The psychology is separated by generations.